Our webinar is recorded. Therefore, if you have friends or colleagues who would like to listen into the webinar, they may do so by just going to our website, fdaqrc.com, and clicking the webinar tab to listen to this webinar. It'll be posted about a week after the webinar is concluded. Once again, my name is Janet Lee. I'm the HR and Marketing Coordinator at FDAQRC, and I am assisting in today's webinar. I also have the pleasure in introducing our presenter, Project Manager Gretchen Upton. Gretchen joined FDAQRC as a project manager in 2017. She has more than 15 years of experience in clinical research trials and medical device development. Gretchen's career highlights include the following. She created and maintained quality systems, managing clinical trials, and gaining U.S. FDA clearance for novel device applications in various divisions, including orthopedic, software decision support. She contributed to the Target System Rating Scale. This is a novel scoring system for child and adolescent psychiatric patients, and she did this while she was employed at the Menninger Clinic. Gretchen's research projects at Cleveland Clinic supported the creation of patient warming standard of care, which is now embraced by the American Society of Anesthesiologists. Gretchen also served on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce America's Business Dialogue Regulatory Affairs Working Group Team 4, which support medical device business development opportunities within Latin American markets. She's most proud of her contributions as a QA-RA team member, which supported the advancement of medicine through research and development. She has done some volunteer work for several charities, including the Red Cross and the San Antonio Food Bank. Gretchen holds a bachelor's degree from Kansas State University and certifications through Regulatory Affairs Professional Society and the Society of Clinical Research Associates, and she is a valuable member of our FDA QRC project management team. So without any further ado, I present Gretchen Upton.
Thanks for the introduction, Janet, and thank you for joining today. It's the week before holidays, so I know everyone's quite busy. Apologies in advance. I have a bit of a cold, so I hope to keep my throat clearing to a minimum, so sorry about that. As Janet mentioned, this session is presented by me, Gretchen Upton of FDAQRC. I'll present the content without interruption, but as she mentioned, you may enter questions into the chat at any time. I'll take questions at the end of the presentation. And please note that, as Janet referenced, many questions were submitted in advance. I'll choose the questions that I feel best address the audience. And as time allows, at the end, I'll answer them. But if you have additional questions, email me as noted on the last page of the slide presentation, and I'll attempt to collate those questions and supply to you after the webinar. So the basic requirement for a quality management system in product development is to anchor and maintain control throughout all stages of product development. This can be achieved through systematic planning, review, and documentation throughout the life cycle. Additionally, both the FDA and ISO 13485 require documented evidence to support that a product development process was followed. In this webinar, I'll use a typical project management process as a guide and link it to the product development requirements in a QMS, or quality management system. I'll also give some examples of documentation that can be used for project monitoring, which demonstrates compliance with the QMS. This webinar is targeted for regulatory affairs, quality assurance professionals new to the regulated medical device industry, or for project managers within those industries. Attendees will learn the basics of project planning, monitoring and control, verification and validation, and associated records. Our main goal for today is to provide a very high-level view of the product development lifecycle as it applies to medical devices. And this view is formed by my own experiences and that of my colleagues here at FDAQRC during various product development projects over the last several years. Obviously, I won't be able to go into details in the time allowed to us, but I hope to start you thinking about how you as an individual and as a company can create and implement a compliant product development plan throughout all stages of the life cycle. So the basic requirement for product development or PD, within a quality management system is a demonstration of project control through systematic planning, review, and documentation during development. Many of the documentation regulatory requirements are captured in this image, which you will see again during this presentation. Besides providing control for the project development within a quality management system is a requirement through both FDA and ISO 13485. This would be through design control and also through product realization, Clause 7 in ISO, which requires documentary evidence that follows the image process. So for example, for initiation, or the initiate in this slide, this would include early feasibility. How can we build quality into the product, which would include customer feedback? What do customers want? Plan. During this stage, the design and development planning takes place, and this is where you identify who is doing what and when. Execute. This would be when you develop design inputs and design outputs, or your software requirements and specifications regarding the physical device and its performance. Monitor and control. This would include verification and validation. How will we know that we have created the device that we want and that it works? Close. This would include design transfer to production, basically moving from development into actual production with the hope of marketing and distributing the device. I also think it's helpful to present some of the concepts within a fictitious scenario. So for the purpose of this webinar, let's assume that we are a project manager or a QA/RA professional for an orthopedic device manufacturer, or here at FDA QRC, if we were to develop a device, and would like to manufacture a bone fixation plate with either locking or unlocking screws. For instance, in this depicted image, we'll call it the FDA QRC clamp. So let's say that our development team has an idea for a device they wish to market also into Europe and would like to know how to properly develop and document their processes. But please keep in mind before we go any further that any images used here are for example only. So some early questions and considerations should be for the initiation phase. What do our surgeons and customers want? Is there a specific design or material they prefer? What does post-market surveillance suggest? Are there any issues with similar devices on the market, perhaps product failures or performance failures? Planning phase. Who is doing what and when? Execute. What is the plate and screw to look like? What should the dimensions be? What materials should it be made out of? Any particular colors? Should this be presented as sterile or non-sterile? Monitor and control. How are we going to know that we designed the right device to fit our needs, our customers' needs, and that it works, and that it continues to work? Close. How do we document the move from the design recipe book to the actual production? What is needed? Well, let's have a closer look. As with any new project, there will be a trigger to initiate the process. For an established manufacturer, customer feedback is highly valuable. For a new manufacturer, this information will need to be sought through a post-market surveillance review of similar devices on the market. This can be done through the US FDA MOD database search for problems, potential harms, or actual harms associated with similar products. You can look them up by FDA product code, or you may also have a look at the FDA recalls database. There are also many other outside the U.S. resources, such as Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, or MHRA, Health Canada, and a Therapeutic Goods Administration, or TGA. Or you may perform a cursory literature review with structured mesh terms. Now, mesh terms are medical subject headings derived from the National Library of Medicine's Controlled Vocabulary Thesaurus. These are used for indexing articles for Medline and PubMed database. Each article citation is associated with a set of mesh terms that describe the content of the citation, and PubMed has some great tutorials to help describe this process. Sales and marketing can provide valuable information about product performance, features that would be helpful either through meetings or conferences with practitioners, or through knowledge of similar devices on the market. Business development teams should also be consulted during the initiation phase. They can provide timelines for new product development and may also have phased features that will be upcoming post-clearance. Regulatory affairs should also be consulted for country-specific regulation, associated conformance standards, and device classification. In our example, this is a new device for FDA QRC. However, a manufacturer and user device facility, or MOD database search, there were many cases of screws that were backing out of plates, so therefore we think we should use a locking screw plate system. Sales and marketing, they've said that blue screws are best. It's easier to see in the body cavity at the end of surgery and for instrument counting. Business development, they've informed us that they would like to offer an array of sizes to fit an anatomy of small and heavy-framed individuals. Regulatory affairs. Through their input, they've told us that since marketing would like to sell in Europe, there's a standard for screws and the number of times that are required. This needs to be a design input. And I'm including this as an actual example. So when I was employed as a regulatory affairs professional at a device manufacturer, I became aware of this European standard for threaded screw times only after a bulk order of non-compliant screws were ordered. The takeaway is to coordinate with regulatory affairs and early feasibility as depicted here, so that required standards, regulations, and country-specific requirements can be built into the product. So for those of you not familiar with the MOD database, it's a vast database searchable by device product code, 510K number, code of federal regulations, name a few, which includes medical device reports or Form 3500A submitted to the FDA by manufacturers. In this example, I was able to determine that an orthopedic screw product is product code HWC. I then performed a basic search from the last 2 years to determine the common issues associated with the device. So these reports can also be exported into an Excel file and searchable by key terms. But keep in mind that these are manufacturer reports and the level of detail varies from each manufacturer. You may also perform a similar search in MedSun, which would yield user facility or hospital reported events, or even have a look at the FDA recalls database to see if any events prompted a full recall. There are similar databases, as I mentioned, for Europe and Australia, among other countries, and eventually the UDAMED database. But UDAMED is set to go live in March 2020, so won't quite be ready yet. So a record including documented evidence that the initiation phase was followed is a requirement of both FDA and ISO 13485. ISO 13485 Clause 7.2 and similarly in 21 CFR 820.30 provides a minimum requirements for discussion during the evaluation process. Examples of these include requirements from customers, organization, and regulatory bodies, determination of organization's ability to meet requirements, decisions, and any follow-up actions. Meeting minutes may be used as documentary evidence that this process has been performed. So at this stage, the project may be initiated, rejected, or shelved. Now, if the decision is to initiate the project, the next stage is developing a plan for it. If a product is shelved, keep good records. That way, potential problems and issues can be diverted if a similar device were to be designed at a later date. So as you can see from the project management wheel of progress, if we can call it that, we've done quite a bit. We've progressed a bit, so we've moved from initiation and we're now at the planning phase. So proper planning is essential for the success of any project. Planning at this stage not only includes the product development plan, but also includes the risk management plan, which is a requirement for a medical device. A proper plan serves as a point of reference for the project team members to understand the scope of the project, clarification of roles and responsibilities, relations between various departments, methodology or process flowchart used, and it highlights important checkpoints or milestones in the developmental stages. This will reduce project delays, avoid cost overruns, scope and design creep, and failure to meet requirements. Roles and responsibilities in the project plan are usually defined for the management representative and the individual departments based on the organization chart or responsibilities matrix. There are two main methods for planning product development, waterfall and agile. So I'll give a high-level overview of each, but would first like to review a bit of the design control basics, as they will be mentioned throughout the rest of the webinar. Okay, so we'll take a few minutes to discuss design control, as these terms will be featured on the next several slides. Please also keep in mind that there are subtle differences between ISO 13485 and FDA 21 CFR 820.30 in terms of product development. This webinar won't go into those subtleties, but the terms below are depicted on this slide are anchored by FDA definitions of each and will provide a base understanding for the rest of this webinar. So, design planning. This is the plan to develop the device with control. Design input. These could also be considered your software requirements. These being the physical and performance requirements of a device that are used as a basis for device design. Design output, or software specifications, mean the results of a design effort at each design phase and at the end of the total design effort. The finished design output is the basis for the device master record, or you may hear it referred to as a recipe book. The total finished design output consists of the device, its packaging and labeling, and the device master record. Design review. This means a documented, comprehensive, systematic examination of a design to evaluate the adequacy of design requirements, to evaluate the capability of the design to meet these requirements, and to identify any problems. Verification. This means confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that specified requirements have been fulfilled. This could be through a dimensional inspection, a code walkthrough, or a code review. Design validation. This means establishing by objective evidence that device specifications conform with user needs and intended use. This could be achieved through simulated or actual use, through a clinical study, bench testing, cadaver testing, or software testing. Transfer. This is moving from development into production. So we're all probably pretty familiar with this diagram. If not, the image on this slide was pasted from the 1997 FDA Design Controls Guidance document. So as you can see, interactions between the various departments and the project development stages depend on the product development methodology which the organization uses. The department involved in each stage of product development process may be assigned in the flowchart or in a separate table. Each milestone of the project may coincide with the development stages where a review meeting may be called for. The waterfall methodology is probably the most basic form of product development methodology, with clearly defined stages carried out in a linear fashion. Now, because this flowchart was included in the FDA guidance, many interpreted that this was the only plan to document design control. However, this is not the case. The FDA does not specify that waterfall is the only method for control. There are alternative methodologies which may be used depending on the project scope and resource availability. And don't be afraid to change from waterfall to agile. This would be a significant change within design control processes. It would need to be documented within your quality management system or reported to your notified body if the device is CE marked. However, if Agile more directly matches the actual work being done, then by all means I would make the switch. I've actually worked for a previous software client and all of their documents were listed in Waterfall, but they clearly worked in Agile, but were just too afraid to change any documents for fear that the FDA would balk. However, that is not the case. You want to be sure your procedures match the processes and actual work being done with control, not the other way around. So shown in this slide is a modified Agile development methodology, which is developed for software development, although the concept may be also used in other product developments. This methodology calls for multiple iterations of the products and feedback from customers at the early stage of development. This addresses a major weakness in the waterfall methodology, where there is no further customer feedback until the product is out on the market. The need for documentation in a quality management system, such as ISO 13485, should not restrict manufacturers from adopting Agile. Compliance with the quality management system depends on how the organization frames the product development process. Having the design verification and validation after iterations and the product requirements and design are finalized does not go against compliance with ISO 13485 or FDA. In fact, the test protocols written and executed during testing of the prototype may be used at a later stage during design verification and validation stages, with minor adjustment in terms of sample size and the control in the test sample used. For example, software manufacturers may validate a story level while also moving forward with incremental validation of the entire device. This is also true of non-software medical devices, validating a portion of the final device early in development while completing a full validation at the end of the project. So if you're a chess player, I think of Agile as being able to move your bishop or rook out ahead of your pawns, whereas waterfall chess player would move the pawns first and then the bishops or knights. So in essence, playing chess in Agile would progress the game a bit earlier, giving early feedback that checkmate is secured, but the rules of checkmate would still apply. Okay, so remember from our previous example, we've already identified the requirements, user needs, and design inputs. So we want a locking screw plate system with blue screws and an array of sizes meeting the European standard screw time requirements. We now need to determine if the development team plans to use a phased gate approach as depicted in Waterfall, or the design will move from phase 1 through phase 4 after meeting gated criteria, or will the team work back and forth? Pre-tests will be modified for final testing. This is something that a regulatory affairs professional can discuss with the research and development team, as it may differ based on project staffing, plans, and expected deadlines, as well as post-market surveillance feedback loop. In our example, let's assume that the team would like to plan and develop an Agile. This will need to be documented within the design control and product planning SOPs and the quality manual, to name a few. But remember also to review the standard AAMI TIR 45 for further explanation. Although the document is for software developers, the same principles are applicable for any manufacturer, as it provides perspectives on the application of Agile during medical device software development. And here I have the standard for you. It's been an FDA-recognized standard since 2013. Now there may be another version released soon, so check that you purchase or review the most up-to-date version if you're planning to move into the European Union under the upcoming MDR. So we have now made it successfully through initiation and planning, and now are ready for execution, monitoring, and control, which I'll tackle together. Okay, I love a good meme, so don't let this be you. A well-written project plan requires good execution to ensure successful completion of the project. This involves commitment from the management and the various departments to the project as outlined in the project plan. Estimation of resources required and schedule in relation to the scope of the project will be tested during the execution stage, and it is therefore important that the value given is realistic at the beginning. Project team members need to understand and commit to the project plan, their assigned role, and responsibility for proper execution of the project. Two documents are often used to track the progress of the product development. They are the Gantt chart and the design input, design output, or trace matrix. In project development, a more detailed form of the Gantt chart is the work breakdown structure, which typically breaks down tasks into different levels with specific assignments of duties and monitoring of progress, as shown in this slide. However, a simple Gantt chart is acceptable for tracking progress under most quality management systems. Basically, as depicted, it's a horizontal chart frequently used in project management in order to plan, coordinate, and track tasks in a project. These can get very complicated very quickly if workflows are dependent, but you can take a spin on this if you'd like to try through Microsoft Project, as they have a free download. Now, the primary function of the trace matrix or design input, design output document is to verify that the design output corresponds to the design input as shown in this slide. The input to the document comprises of items from various sources such as design requirements, risk assessment, technical specifications, and regulatory requirements. It usually contains all of the requirements stated in the design requirement document and more. This document is normally used as a reference to verification and validation activities. This is usually the point where I get a lot of questions. So, for example, if parts and pieces or components of the device are purchased off the shelf, or from Amazon, for example, is it really necessary to list them in the trace matrix? The answer is yes. Even though these are purchased off the shelf, perhaps as general supplies, the intended use is for a medical device, so you need to bring them into your quality system. As such, list the requirements and specifications based upon dimensions and materials. But keep in mind that these will then become the dimensional inspections that quality assurance or quality control will use for incoming inspections, and purchasing will also use when buying new parts and pieces. It can be tempting not to go through all this work, but I've been employed at some places where they didn't add parts and pieces to the trace matrix. In one instance, a bulk order of K-wire, which is general equipment, was purchased at a great deal. The only issue was the sale was for double trocar tips, or double pointed tips, which cannot be used in most surgical settings due to potential glove sticks. The entire order couldn't be used or returned, so we had to eat it. If the purchaser had just looked at the trace matrix before ordering, they would have noticed that a single trocar tip or single pointed tip was required. So it's very important that these documents are up to date and the information is shared with quality assurance, regulatory affairs, purchasing, as well as manufacturing. In general, all verification and validation activities shall be traceable and flow from design requirements, design input, design output documents, and or risk assessments as illustrated in this slide. In some organizations, the design input, design output document, or trace matrix, is used to monitor the project progress in place of the Gantt chart. This can be done by having the output corresponding to the input dated and signed off in the document, which is a requirement for design output under FDA 21 CFR 820, as well as ISO 13485, which states that planning output shall be documented and updated as appropriate as design and the development progresses. Therefore, it's not mandatory to use a Gantt chart for the purpose of monitoring development progress. Once the list of design input is completed, it is recommended that the corresponding engineering specifications should be added where applicable. This will provide the acceptance criteria during verification and validation tests to determine whether the product has met the input. So as I mentioned, all verification and validation activities shall be traceable to design requirements, trace matrix documents, and our risk assessment as illustrated in this slide. Verification and validation are needed to demonstrate sufficient knowledge and information on the medical device to provide that its safety and performance meet its intended use. Verification shall be performed to ensure that design and development inputs have met the design and development input requirements. The definition for validation was given as to ensure that the resulting product is capable of meeting the requirements for the specified application or intended use. Now remember, if you're using agile development, you may have already validated a sample set, and full validation is therefore expected. Now, unlike research or experimental tests, verification and validation test results must be measured against a set of acceptance criteria to determine whether the test passes or fails. The acceptance criteria are typically found in the trace matrix document under engineering specifications to meet the design requirements. Any measuring instruments used in verification and validation tests should also be calibrated to ensure that the results are accurate and acceptable. The use of acceptable test standards for verification and validation exercises to facilitate approval from the regulatory bodies is always preferred. But because most verification tests are based on component-level materials and simple structure, the procedures for them can be found in international standards from ISO or ASTM. The FDA provides a list of recognized consensus standards on their website, as I mentioned previously, However, if there is no applicable international standard, the next best option would be to use experimental procedures reported in academic publications. Without any relevant references to use, the final option is to design your own experiment for the verification tests. These can be submitted to the FDA. I have successfully submitted in-house testing results and protocols where there's not a standard test method. So it can be done. Don't be afraid. So here we have our completed trace matrix for the FDA QRC clamp device. Now, remember that we wanted to offer this device in an array of sizes. So testing will need to be done on the full array, so from smallest through the largest. For example, device tolerances, strength, and other bench tests should encompass the smallest potential size through the largest potential size that we plan to market. That way, if intermediate sizes are added, there's an option later to file a letter to file as opposed to a full 510K. Next, we're on to review, a design review. A review meeting is often pre-planned in the development plan document to signal the end of one stage of development and the beginning of the next stage. The main purpose of the review meeting is to evaluate product development, progress against documented requirements, and to highlight any problems and follow-up actions. This meeting shall be attended by various functional team members so that any cross-functional issues can be identified and rectified. Some regulatory bodies, such as the FDA, may also require an individual not directly responsible for the product development stage to be present during the review meeting. ISO 13485 requires that review meetings and the attendance be documented as evidence. This can be particularly challenging for new startups, and I've seen this over and over again, and it's very typical, where there is very little design documentation, or documentation consists of a few emails, and there aren't any records of meeting minutes or signatures. This is another point not to panic. It can be salvaged. And also remember that for FDA, only one documented design review is required. So I don't know if you can see it, but here is an example of a form that can be used during design review meetings. It includes general product information, design review topics, a list of attendees, summary of meeting, and a place for signatures of approvers. In organizations which have a robust quality system, there may be an SOP or signatory authority matrix. If that's the case, make sure that those that are needed to sign actually get the chance to sign in, attend the meeting, and sign any other documents. Or if they're not available, make sure that backups are assigned and also predetermined within that signatory authority form. So as you can see, we've tackled a lot today. We are now ready for closure. Once the product development phase has been completed, the next phase is to transfer the product design to production. This requires close cooperation between the design team and the manufacturing department. A device master record, or as I've been referring to it today, the recipe book, as required by the FDA, has good guidance on the type of information that needs to be generated. Required information is as follows. 1. Device details, such as specifications, including drawings, composition, formulation, component specification, and software specification. Change management, how to address device or design processes or changes in a controlled environment. Quality management, this would include work instructions, which include acceptance criteria within quality control. Packaging and labeling, this would include specifications and work instructions and the actual labeling control. Process information. This would include equipment specifications, calibrations, validations, work instructions, and environmental control. Installation and maintenance. This would include just that, control regarding how to install and properly maintain the device, and also servicing procedures and methods as applicable. Proper and complete records of the product development shall be gathered and filed according to regulatory requirements. The FDA requires a Design History File, or DHF, which contains the design history of the finished product. This contains or references records to show that the product is designed according to plan and has met the stated requirements. This essentially contains all the documents generated through the course of product development, including the design plan, trace matrix, meeting minutes, verification and validation tests, and design transfer records. There's no specific requirement for CE Mark and ISO 13485 for a DHF. However, under 13485, there must be proper documentation to demonstrate compliance with the quality system. So in this example, we have our DMR, or recipe book, for the FDA QRC clamp. Items in bold are those that we have created today during this webinar as a PM for the clamp project. The remaining items may require input and ownership from regulatory affairs, marketing, engineering, and manufacturing. So we had, as I mentioned previously, we had some questions that were submitted early. So I'm going to go ahead and run through those. So if there are any other questions, please add them to the chat box. We are making excellent time. So the first question that was submitted in the beginning was, are design controls really needed during development? Can they just be brought in at the end? Well, the first thing the FDA looks for in a submission, this could be either a 510K or a de novo, is how the product was developed. Did the developer follow a formal design control process? And do they have evidence of compliance with the process? And also, when a US FDA investigator reviews your design control requirements, they will evaluate the control process, not determine if the design is appropriate, safe, or effective. Since a significant number of medical device recalls are due to design problems, it's advisable for design controls to be in place prior to approval of the system-level requirements document and after completion of the feasibility phase. Next question was, should a patent search be conducted as part of the process? And when should patent research be complete? Typically, patent searching and research is conducted during the early feasibility phase or the initiation phase. This can be done by a skilled regulatory affairs professional or through a legal advisor if a new product seems similar to a patented product. Now, Google Scholar also can provide a great cursory search, but yes, it's always very important. Next question was, why is it important for proper implementation and execution of the quality management system in product development? Proper implementation and execution of the quality management system in product development will facilitate management, monitoring, and control of the project progress. Proper documentation allows tracking and control of the project and product development without the need for frequent meetings. Scope, resources, and timeline for the project will also be clear for all team members and functional groups while retaining flexibility. A quality management system such as ISO 13485 on product realization, Clause 7, as I mentioned, requires documentary evidence that follows the project management process. Another question was, what are the minimum requirements for discussion during the evaluation process? Well, ISO 13485, Clause 7, provides a list of minimum requirements for discussion during the evaluation process. Examples include, but are not limited to, requirements from customer, organization, and regulatory bodies, determination of organization's ability to meet those requirements, decisions, and any follow-up actions. Meeting minutes may be used as documentary evidence that this process has been performed. And then another question, what information is needed by the DMR?
Yes, does the literature search help with your design? And does the FDA give you credit for doing a literature search of the the current science?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question. Could you repeat?
Yes, I noticed at the beginning you had literature search,
Yes.
and does the FDA give you credit when you're doing your design inputs for doing a search on the current scientific literature on a certain topic? For example, like you said, there catheterization balloons or something like that, or medicine dosing, or different topics. Does doing a search of the literature count as a design input, and how important is it?
Yes, it does count as a design input. And I wouldn't say, initially you mentioned FDA giving credit. I wouldn't say they would give credit, but it's an expectation. Especially if this is a new device for the market. Oftentimes you don't really know the risk profile if it's a novel device. So you need to go out and perform that literature review, post-market surveillance review of other devices on the market. And yes, if you're noticing, like we used in this example of screws backing out of plates, if this were a real device that we were designing, perhaps we would want to make that an input, as we did in this example today, a locking screw system so that we wouldn't have that problem. So yes, always a very important first step.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question. I have one more that was solicited in advance. I'll read this, and if there are any others, feel free to ask or enter into the chat box at any time. Another question was, what information is needed by the Device Master Record, or the DMR? This is the one I was calling throughout this webinar as the recipe book. So the information required by the DMR includes device specification, including drawings, composition, formulation, component specification, software specification, production process specification, including equipment, work instructions and environment, quality assurance work instructions, including acceptance criteria like we discussed earlier, packaging and labeling specifications, as well as work instructions for perhaps placing those labels onto the boxes, and installation and maintenance as needed. So it's basically, the DMR is everything from design output, and this is a required document by FDA. Janet, do we have any other questions that have been submitted?
I have nothing. Oh, here we go. We got one more here.
Okay.
If you click on the chat box, you should be able to see the question from Ezra.
Okay, so the question was, how do you recommend documenting the 820.30 planning requirements when performing minor design changes like artwork updates? So with this, if I'm understanding your question correctly, how do you document when you make changes to those initial documents that were created? These would go through your change control process. Right, perhaps initially in your device and development plan, you envisioned maybe one feature, or maybe it was your labeling that you envisioned how you thought it would work out, and then later on maybe that changes after maybe device approval or when it's been on the market a while. That would then, you would wrap that in your change control process and procedure, a formal change control of those documents, and then have proper authority sign off for that. If you have that, signatory authority matrix, or have the original approvers who signed the first version, then approve the change version. And I hope that answered your question. Perfect. Any other questions, Janet?
I don't believe we have any other questions at this time. For those who would like a certificate, you can either email Gretchen, and her email is there on the screen, or you can email myself, j.lee@fdaqrc.com, and hopefully we'll have those out. I'm crossing my fingers before 4th of July, but if not, the first full week of July.
Yep, and we can help with any step in this process. We do this all the time. So if this is something that you don't feel comfortable with, you know, we can have a call, we can discuss it. We can help you at any phase in this process. And sorry that I talked so fast. I guess I give you 10 minutes back if we don't have any other questions.
It looks like that's it. So thank you everyone for joining our webinar. If you have questions, feel free to email them to Gretchen, and we're here to help.
Thank you.